Somewhere in the basement of a hospital that no longer exists, there is water. Still water. Dark, cold, and perfectly still. And somewhere beneath that water, wrapped in the ruin of soaked paper and collapsed shelving, is the only record of a man who once gave sight back to people who had forgotten what light looked like. Nobody went looking for it in time. And by the time anyone thought to ask, the water had already done what water does. It had erased everything. This is not a story about medicine. Exactly, it is a story about what disappears when the world stops paying attention. It is a story about a doctor named Edmund Harwell, a basement, a flood, and the strange and heartbreaking way that a miracle can vanish without a single person noticing. Let us go back to 1924. England in the winter of that year was a country still haunted. The Great War had ended 6 years earlier, but it had not truly ended for the people living inside it. There were men on every street corner who could not forget what they had seen in the trenches. There were women who had learned to recognize the sound a man makes when he wakes up screaming at 3 a.m. The country was rebuilding, yes, but quietly under the surface of that reconstruction, something had broken in the human spirit that nobody quite knew how to name. And in a city that has since been absorbed by larger towns and largely forgotten, there was a small hospital, not a grand institution. Not a place with marble floors or famous consultants. It was the kind of hospital that served working people, miners and mill workers and their families, people who could not afford to be sick but were sick anyway. It had 40 beds. It had 3 physicians. And it had, in a converted storage room on the ground floor, a practice run by a man named Edmund Harwell. Nobody remembers exactly how Harwell came to that hospital. The records that might have told us are gone now. What we do know, pieced together from a handful of surviving letters and a single newspaper clipping from 1927, is that he arrived sometime in the early 1920s, that he was not a young man when he arrived, and that he brought with him a method that nobody else in the region was using. He was treating blindness, not all kinds of blindness, not the blindness that comes from birth defects or from catastrophic trauma. He was treating a specific and particularly cruel kind of vision loss, the slow, creeping darkness that came from untreated pressure behind the eyes, from scarred tissue, from conditions that most doctors of the era simply told their patients to accept. Harwell did not accept them. The 1927 newspaper clipping, which is the single most substantial piece of evidence we have that Edmund Harwell ever existed, describes in careful and admiring language a procedure he had developed over years of quiet experimentation. The journalist who wrote the piece was not a medical writer. He was a local reporter who had heard something remarkable and gone to see it for himself. And what he saw was this: a woman named Agnes Pollard, who had been functionally blind for 4 years, sitting in a chair in a small examination room, reading aloud from a piece of paper, not squinting, not guessing. Reading, the journalist wrote that her voice was perfectly steady. He wrote that she read 3 full lines before she stopped and pressed her hands over her eyes and began to cry. She was not crying from sadness. Harwell, the journalist noted, stood in the corner of the room with his arms crossed. He was described as a heavy-set man with a gray beard and very calm eyes. When the journalist asked him how he had done it, Harwell apparently gave a long answer that the journalist struggled to summarize accurately. The gist of it, as best as we can tell, was that he had developed a combination of surgical technique and a compound of his own formulation that reduced the internal scarring that was blocking Agnes Pollard's optic function. He had done it in 3 sessions over the course of 2 months, and he had done it, the journalist noted with some amazement, for no charge. Harwell was not wealthy. He was not connected to any university or research institution. He had no funding. He had no assistance. He had, by all accounts, nothing except a room in a small hospital, a set of instruments he had modified himself, and a mind that refused to stop asking why people who could be helped were being left in the dark. Over the following years, we know from the letters that he treated at least 37 patients with vision impairment. We know that some of them recovered fully. We know that others recovered partially. We know that a small number of them did not recover at all, and that Harwell wrote about those cases with a grief that comes through even in the dry language he used. He was not a sentimental man in his writing. But there is a letter addressed to a colleague in another city whose name we cannot read because the ink has faded, where Harwell describes sitting with a patient after a failed procedure. The patient was a man who had worked in a glass factory and lost his sight to chemical exposure. Harwell could not help him. And in that letter, he writes a single sentence that feels like it came from somewhere very deep inside him. He writes, "The worst part is not that I have failed. The worst part is that I do not yet know why." That is the sentence of a man who has not given up. And here is where the story becomes something stranger and more terrible. Harwell continued his work through the late 1920s. The letters suggest he was refining his compound, improving his technique. There are references to notes, to detailed case files, to a manuscript he was assembling that he described in one letter as a record that might be useful to someone with more resources than myself. He knew he was working in isolation. He knew that without institutional support, without publication in a proper journal, his work might not reach the people who could build on it. He was trying to create something that could outlast him, a body of documentation that another physician, somewhere, someday, might find and continue. He was building, in other words, an archive. And the archive was kept in his room at the hospital, in filing cabinets, in leather folders, in the careful handwriting of a man who had spent decades training himself to observe and record. Every patient, every session, every measurement, every outcome, every failure, and every recovery. 37 patients, years of work, the entire private science of Edmund Harwell gathered in one place. Now stop for a moment. Think about what that means. Because somewhere between 1930 and 1935, something happened to Edmund Harwell. We do not know exactly what. The letters stop. The newspaper clipping is the last public mention of him. He does not appear in any obituary records that have been found, though the records from that region and that period are notoriously incomplete. He simply ceases to appear. He may have died. He may have left. He may have become too ill to continue his work. We do not know, but his archive stayed. The hospital continued operating after Harwell was gone. The room that had been his examination space was converted to other uses. His filing cabinets were moved into storage, most likely, down to the basement, which is where things go in institutions when nobody knows quite what to do with them, but nobody is willing to throw them away entirely. The archive of Edmund Harwell sat in a hospital basement for years, possibly for decades, gathering dust in the particular way that abandoned things gather dust, slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing. There was a woman named Dorothea Ames who worked as an administrative clerk at the hospital from 1948 until it closed. She was interviewed once, briefly, by a local historian in the 1980s who was compiling notes for a book that was never finished. The tape of that interview survived. The book did not. And in the interview, Dorothea Ames mentions almost in passing that there were boxes in the basement. Old medical boxes. She had seen them when she went down there looking for stationery supplies in her first year. She had not looked inside them. She had noticed that they were labeled in a handwriting she did not recognize, that the labels were faded, and that several of the folders inside were wrapped in a kind of oilcloth that suggested whoever had packed them had been trying to protect them from moisture. Moisture, that single word, sits in the middle of this story like a door that has already been closed. because the basement of that hospital had a history with water. The building sat on ground that was not well drained. In wet winters, which in that part of England is most winters, the lowest level of the building would take on water. Nothing catastrophic, usually, a few inches. Enough to be an inconvenience. Enough that the maintenance staff kept pumps down there and ran them periodically through the cold months. It was a known problem, a managed problem, the kind of problem that institutions learn to live with. Until the winter of 1963. Nobody who has investigated this story has been able to find a precise account of what happened that winter. What is known is that the pumps failed. What is known is that the failure was not discovered immediately because it happened over a long weekend when the hospital was running on minimal staff. What is known is that by the time someone went down to the basement and opened the door, the water was not a few inches. It was above waist height. It had been sitting there, cold and dark and perfectly patient, for at least 4 days. Everything in that basement was destroyed. Not everything in the hospital, just everything in the basement. Equipment, pharmaceutical stock, administrative archives going back decades, and a set of filing cabinets containing the documented life's work of a man who had once stood in a small room and watched a blind woman read. It is possible that someone at some point before 1963 looked at those filing cabinets and understood what was in them. It is possible that somewhere there is a person who read Harwell's case files and thought, I should tell someone about this. It is possible that the manuscript he was assembling was seen by eyes that could have recognized its value. We cannot know. We cannot know because the flood took everything, including the possibility of knowing. This is the thing about catastrophic loss that people do not always understand. It is not just the thing itself that is lost. It is the evidence that the thing existed. It is the proof. When the water came up in that basement and soaked through those leather folders and dissolved those careful pages of handwriting, it did not just destroy Edmund Harwell's archive. It destroyed the confirmation that the archive had ever been worth preserving. It left behind nothing that could make a compelling case for its own importance. And so nobody made the case. The hospital closed eventually. The building was repurposed, then partially demolished, then left. The local historian whose tape recorder captured Dorothea Ames's passing mention of the boxes in the basement died in 1991 without finishing his book. The tape sat in a box in a house until someone found it and recognized it for what it was. That tape is now the closest thing we have to a witness. Dorothea Ames herself lived to be 92. She died in 2009. In the years before her death, she had lost much of her memory to age, but there is a recorded conversation made by a granddaughter who was studying local history, where Dorothea speaks about the boxes again. She is an old woman in this recording. Her voice is thin and careful. She says she always wondered what was in them. She says she should have looked. She says she thinks about it sometimes. The granddaughter asks her what she thinks was inside, and Dorothea is quiet for a long moment before she answers. She says, I think it was something that mattered to somebody. That is probably the most accurate summary of Edmund Harwell's archive that we will ever have. There is a kind of grief that comes from loss that happened before you arrived. A grief for things you never had, never knew, never touched. It is a strange and almost abstract grief, and it is easy to dismiss it as sentimental. But here is why it matters. Here is why the story of Edmund Harwell and the flooded basement is not simply a sad footnote in local history. In the century since 1924, medicine has made extraordinary progress in treating vision loss. Surgical techniques, pharmaceutical compounds, cellular therapies. The field has advanced in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the doctors of Harwell's era. And yet there are still people, today, who lose their sight to the kinds of conditions he was treating. There are still patients for whom the available treatments are insufficient. There are still physicians sitting in examination rooms looking at cases that should be solvable and not quite knowing why they cannot solve them. We do not know if Harwell's compound would have led anywhere significant. We do not know if his technique was genuinely novel or if it was a version of something that was later developed independently by someone else. We do not know, and we cannot know because the evidence is gone. But here is what we do know. A man who had nothing except a rented room and a refusal to accept the limits of his knowledge developed a procedure that gave sight back to people who had been told they would never see again. He documented everything. He built an archive. He tried with the limited tools available to him to make sure that what he had learned would not disappear when he did. And it disappeared anyway. Not because he failed, not because he was wrong, not because his work was not worth preserving, but because of a pump that failed over a long weekend in 1963 and a basement that nobody drained in time. The photograph that runs with the 1927 newspaper clipping is not a photograph of Harwell. It is a photograph of the hospital exterior, a gray stone building with tall windows. There is a figure in one of the windows, upper floor, barely visible, just a silhouette. Impossible to know who it was. Impossible to know if it meant anything. But every time someone looks at that clipping, they look at that silhouette. And they wonder. Because that is what this story does. It makes you wonder about the things that were almost saved. About the archives that came within a few inches, a few days, a single working pump of surviving long enough to matter. About the knowledge that is sitting right now in basements and attics and back rooms, not yet lost, not yet found, waiting for someone to look before the water comes. Agnes Pollard, the woman who sat in that chair and read 3 lines aloud and then pressed her hands over her eyes and wept, she had grandchildren. They are gone now too. But somewhere in those grandchildren's lives, there were mornings when they woke and looked out a window at the light and did not think about what it cost. Did not think about the gray-bearded man who stood in a corner with his arms crossed and his very calm eyes watching a woman receive back something that had been taken from her. They did not know to think about it. How could they? Edmund Harwell gave sight to people who had been living in darkness, and then the darkness took him. It took his name. It took his work. It took the only record that something extraordinary had happened in a small room in a forgotten building in a winter 100 years ago. And all that is left is water, still water. And the faint, persistent sense that somewhere just below the surface of what we know, something is waiting to be found, something important, something true. Something that deserved better than to be erased by a flood that nobody noticed until it was already too late.